Man digs up mom's coffin because gut feeling told him to. Then this happens. Rain fell in slow, steady drops over Pine Hollow Cemetery, the kind that seemed to sink into the bones. Mark Walker stood at his mother's grave, his coat collar turned up against the chill. The oak trees creaked in the wind, their bare branches swaying like they were whispering secrets to one another. He didn't know why he kept coming back here. 15 years had passed since the funeral, but lately, every visit left him more uneasy than before. He brushed the wet leaves from the headstone, tracing her name with his fingers. Margaret Walker, beloved mother, a kind woman whose laughter once filled every corner of their small home. But now, standing here, Mark felt something different. Not just grief, but a strange pull in his gut, like a knot tightening. The caretaker, Earl, shuffled nearby, his flashlight cutting through the mist. He was an old man who had seen too many burials, too many tears. He gave Mark a slow nod, but said nothing. There wasn't much to say. Earl had seen him come here dozens of times over the years, sometimes late at night, just standing there, staring at the ground. That night, when Mark finally drove home, the air inside his truck felt heavier than the fog outside. He turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but nothing helped. The song that played, an old tune his mother used to hum while making breakfast, made his chest ache. He turned it off and drove the rest of the way in quiet. Sleep didn't come easy anymore. When it did, it came with dreams. The same one, over and over. His mother sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm but serious. She would turn to him slowly, lips parting as if to speak. But before she could, he always woke up. The next morning, the sky was pale gray, the kind of light that never really brightened. Mark sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee going cold. He couldn't explain it, not to himself, not to anyone. But deep inside, he felt it. Something about his mother's grave wasn't right. And then, that evening, the phone rang. It was his sister, Helen. Her voice trembled. She said she'd been having the same dream. The days that followed felt heavier, slower. Mark moved through them like a man walking underwater. Each morning he woke with that same weight in his chest, the kind that made it hard to breathe. He drove past the cemetery more than once, pretending he was just taking the long way to work. But his eyes always found his mother's headstone through the trees. Helen stopped by one afternoon, her face drawn and tired. She tried to talk about ordinary things, her kids, the weather, the latest town gossip, but the words didn't land. She finally set her cup down and looked straight at him. She said she'd had the dream again. Their mother, sitting by the window, turning her head slowly. The same calm look, the same silence before waking. They both sat there for a long time, not saying much. Some things didn't need to be said to be understood. The following evening, Mark drove into town. He parked near the post office and walked toward the hardware store, hands buried in his jacket pockets. A few folks nodded politely as he passed. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where people noticed everything, especially when something felt off. By the time he reached the store, he could feel the stares. He ignored them. Later that week, a thick fog rolled through the valley, settling low over the fields and roads. Mark stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching it creep across the yard. The air smelled damp, earthy. When he finally walked back inside, something caught his eye through the kitchen window. His mother's favorite flowers, lilacs, sitting fresh on the porch steps. The petals glistened with dew, too new to have been there long. He looked up and down the empty street, but no one was there. That night, he sat by the living room window, staring out into the mist. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. He tried to read but couldn't focus. Around midnight, the silence broke. A soft rustle at the front door. When he opened it, no one was there. Just an envelope on the porch, his name written across the front in shaky handwriting. Inside were 5 words. The truth was buried with her. The morning came wrapped in fog so thick it swallowed the headstones whole. The ground was slick with dew, and every sound seemed muted, distant. Mark stood near the old oak that leaned over his mother's grave, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His breath came out in clouds as he watched the small crew set up their equipment. No one spoke much. The air felt too heavy for words. Earl was there too, flashlight hanging from his belt, hat pulled low over his brow. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, his eyes darting from the grave to Mark. He'd seen strange things in this line of work, but this one unsettled him. Every so often he'd mutter something under his breath, words that drifted away before they could be heard. The men began their work. The dull thud of shovels hitting dirt echoed through the cemetery. Mark watched as clumps of earth were lifted away, the dark soil damp and rich. A crow landed on a nearby branch and let out a single sharp cry. Mark's stomach turned. The sound lingered longer than it should have. As the digging went on, something in the air began to change. The fog grew heavier, curling low around their feet. The faint smell of metal hung in the breeze, sharp and cold. One of the workers paused, wiping his brow, and said it smelled like rain. But it wasn't rain. It was something else, something older. When the first corner of the coffin appeared, Mark stepped closer. The wood looked darker than he remembered from the funeral. Earl crouched beside it, running his gloved hand along the edge. He frowned. The seal looked newer, the bolts cleaner than the rest. He said quietly that this wasn't how it had been left all those years ago. The workers stopped and stepped back. Mark knelt beside the coffin, tracing his hand across the surface. His heart thudded against his ribs. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the lid creaked open. The sound of wood giving way echoed through the fog. Inside, the first thing Mark saw wasn't what he expected. Resting against the faded silk was a small, rusted metal box, and taped to its lid, a note written in his mother's familiar hand. The crowd that had gathered near the grave fell into a hush. The only sound was the soft whine of the wind as it moved through the trees. Mark stared at the box lying on the faded silk. It was small, no bigger than his hand, but somehow it felt heavier than the coffin itself. Earl took a slow step forward, his face pale. He said quietly that some things were best left alone, but his voice trembled as if he didn't even believe his own words. Mark reached down, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The box rattled faintly, something shifting inside. A chill ran up his arm. He lifted it out carefully, setting it against his chest like it might break apart if he held it wrong. The note fluttered slightly in the breeze, edges yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was his mother's. For Mark. When you're ready. He didn't open it there. Not in front of the others, not with the weight of so many eyes on him. Instead, he walked back to his truck in silence, the box cradled tightly in his hands. The drive home felt endless. Every bump in the road made the metal rattle softly, a sound that seemed to echo through the cab long after it stopped. When he finally stepped inside the house, the evening light had already faded. The box sat on the kitchen table, still damp from the grave. Mark poured himself a drink he didn't finish, staring at it from across the room. For a while, he just listened to the ticking of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. It was strange how loud silence could be. Hours passed before he finally sat down. His hands were unsteady as he pried the lid open with a screwdriver. The sound of the metal giving way made his heart race. Inside, he found a bundle of letters, neatly tied with a thin blue ribbon. Their edges were brittle, their paper worn, but each one had his name written on it. Mark unfolded the first letter, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The handwriting was his mother's, but the signature at the bottom wasn't hers. It was his father's. Mark sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the open letters scattered before him like pieces of a life he never knew existed. Each one was written in the same familiar hand, strong, steady, and filled with warmth. His father's words reached across time, speaking of birthdays missed, memories hoped for, and a love that never faded. The lines were full of apologies, not excuses, and every word seemed to echo through the quiet house. He read until his eyes burned. The letters told a story that didn't match the one he had carried all his life. His father hadn't left because he didn't care. He had been sick, far sicker than anyone had known, and had gone away for treatment, hoping to spare his family the pain of watching him fade. His mother had kept that truth to herself, shouldering both grief and guilt, so her children could go on without the weight of it. At the bottom of the box, beneath the bundle of letters, was one final envelope. The paper was newer, the ink darker, as if it had been written not long before Margaret's death. On the front were the words, "For when you've forgiven me." Mark opened it with trembling hands. His mother's handwriting was softer this time, slower, as if she'd written through tears. She explained everything, how she had hidden the letters so her children would remember their father as strong and alive, not broken and dying. She wrote that she never meant to deceive them, only to protect them. And she thanked Mark for listening to his heart, for finding what she could never bring herself to say. As the first light of morning slipped through the window, Mark walked back to the cemetery. The fog had lifted, and the air was still. He knelt by his mother's grave and placed the empty box beside her headstone. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. Weeks later, a small package arrived from a town he didn't recognize. Inside was a locket engraved with his mother's initials, and a note in his father's hand, "For when he's old enough to understand." Mark closed his hand around it and smiled through tears. The past, once heavy with sorrow, had finally turned to peace,